Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. Glad you are back. We're talking about human trafficking in Tennessee and a new program designed to fight human trafficking. We have with us Margie Quin. She is with In Slavery Tennessee. She's really just laid out how big of a problem human trafficking is, how you define human trafficking. Now I want to get into Operation Safe and Sound, this new program. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so it's a great new program. It's spearheaded by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the human trafficking agents, and it's a collaborative effort between TBI, local law enforcement, the Department of Children's Services, juvenile courts, and local nonprofits like In Slavery Tennessee to try to go out and find children who are in a missing status or who we know have been previously trafficked or in high risk situations. Go out and make contact with those kids, find those kids, and either return them to a safe location, safe and stable housing, or make contact with some child that we know has been trafficked, and sit down with them and say, hey, how are you doing? What do you need? Do you need any resources? And just kind of establish that relationship. I've found that the relationship that you can establish with a survivor of trafficking is it is probably the most powerful thing we can do to start that healing process.
Wow, I bet. Can you give us an example of a couple of people that you've helped that would help us understand who is getting caught up in this, and walk us through a few examples of people?
Sure. And I'm probably going to pull some from my days, my years at TBI, and some from In Slavery Tennessee, and just kind of tell you what I saw. The folks that were under the age of 18, there were very, very similar stories, and it was drug addicted parents, drug addicted mothers, many times a mother who herself had probably been trafficked or who was involved in prostitution. The exposure to that lifestyle early on. We're talking about early substance use disorder in kids starting at really young ages, 12, 13 years old, and pretty severe neglect. So if you've got a parent that's drug addicted and or prostituting, it's not uncommon that they are not watching their kids. And so kids are out kind of running the street, doing things they shouldn't, because they don't know any better and nobody's taught them. There are, on the adult side, we've seen women fall on hard times, lose a job, become homeless, develop a mental illness, and start using street drugs in order to cope with mental illness, which then leads to potentially a trafficking situation. Drug addicted individuals are extraordinarily vulnerable to a trafficker because there's such a strong means of control. Once you control the flow of narcotics to a drug addicted person, you can almost force them to do anything. And I've seen some pretty amazing things, especially with the opioid epidemic that we've got going on in the state of Tennessee. I think if people want to hear from survivors, if they want to hear a survivor experience in their voice, they can tune into our podcast. We have a podcast called Someone Like Me, and they can find that wherever you find a podcast. And our survivors who have kind of crossed over into alumni status, we'll talk about some part of their journey. Some talk about kind of how they got there and some early childhood experiences. Some talk about the journey, once they exit trafficking. And the healing journey is typically nonlinear. So it's not like a straight line. You recover somebody, they enter into services, and everything is, roses and sunshine. That's a very, very difficult journey, and there are ups and downs and relapses. And, in my agency, we are really committed to this person, whether they come in and out of services, whether they go up and down, we're going to stick with them for a long time. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I got a message from a survivor that I had worked with when I was at the TBI, and I had not heard from her in several years, and she was doing okay, but was kind of struggling and having some problems, and she reached out. And what was interesting was she didn't even know I was in Slavery, Tennessee, and she had gotten services from in Slavery, Tennessee. But we were able to help her, in her time of need. And so those relationships are very powerful. And if they are done correctly, a survivor will return to you even if they relapsed.
That's great, and that's what's so important. That's fascinating about the podcast. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's very interesting. How much do we see in Nashville that is the result of the fact we're a big tourist destination? Does that fuel things here, or does that not play a role? What about that part of it?
Yes and no. I think there's a lot of misinformation around big events like the Super Bowl. There's a lot of discussion about trafficking in the Super Bowl. There's nothing about the NFL that causes trafficking. If you have an influx of people into the Nashville area, for instance, you're going to have more crime, just more crime generally. It doesn't necessarily mean more trafficking. So I think Tennessee is both a destination state as well as a pass-through state. There are just a lot of people coming in and out of our state. And I think you can see as the TBI just continues to do these undercover operations all across the state in big towns and small towns, and they are never not successful. And I can tell you that some of the things that I saw when I was running the operations were very surprising. And I had been in law enforcement a long time. Worked patrol in the metro Atlanta area. I thought I had seen pretty much all you could see. And there were things that I saw and heard that were just shocking to me. And I can imagine how shocked the audience would be as well.
Well, and that's depressing. And yeah, here in the news, 13 arrested in multi-agency human trafficking operation. 13 arrested. So it's talking about 13 suspects. This was in Hendersonville, I believe, TBI, Hendersonville Police, Sumner County. So you said they're never not successful. Every time you run one of these stings, you're arresting several people. You've done this. A dozen people. Yeah. A dozen people. You've done this a long time. Are you depressed by that? Are you hopeful for the future, or do you ever just say, what in the world?
Yeah, and I'll tell you that now within Slavery, Tennessee, we're partnering on these operations, and so we're always either on scene with the TBI or we're a short phone call away in the event that they recover a victim of trafficking. And so I started that when I was the assistant special agent in charge. I always had the nonprofit out there with me. We wanted a more trauma responsive law enforcement. We wanted law enforcement to engage with nonprofits and let nonprofits do what nonprofits do best, which is serve people, and let law enforcement do what they do best, which is investigate crime and put people who have committed crimes in jail. What was so surprising, I think, in running all those operations, and just I'm not in the middle of them anymore, but I have a pretty good sense of probably what's going on. You put up an ad on an online site, and immediately you start getting calls, and it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calls from unique numbers, and people are showing up to buy a kid.
And you make it clear it's a kid. I mean, they know what's going on here.
Yeah, it's not a surprise.
I mean, that's just okay.
It's not they get there and, oh, she's 14. Right. The first time we did this, they changed state law. The General Assembly changed state law so that law enforcement could pose as a minor. And the first time we did it was in March of 2016. Governor Haslam signed the law, and I was in a hotel room with several teams a week later. And the first two men that we arrested who traveled to us to pay to have sex with a kid were youth pastors in Knoxville. And so and people say, was that shocking? That not really. Not really.
Well, I find it shocking. I'm shocked.
Well, you look at Larry Nassar in USA Gymnastics, you look at Jerry Sandusky at Penn State, men who are persons who have a preference for children are going to put themselves in a position either through their occupation, their hobbies, to have access to children. And so it's unfortunately not shocking to me when you arrest somebody who has had access to children and is then accused of abusing those children.
And back to that other question I asked, maybe I'll re-ask it differently. Are you optimistic that there will ever be a time when you will put up an ad and you won't arrest at least 13 people? Are you optimistic, you put up an ad and you won't be able to arrest just a lot of people? Will we get to that day?
Not in my lifetime. I think the proliferation of the internet and the accessibility of pornography is and the commodification of sex and children, and people are just inundated with it everywhere they turn. I think it's going to be a long time before we get to a point in our society where we say we're not going to tolerate this. And I've said it a lot, if women could solve the problem of things like trafficking and rape and domestic violence, we would have solved them already. So it's going to take men to engage in this fight and hold other men accountable so that we can start to change the culture, because really this is a culture problem, and we've got to change the culture, and we're going to have to partner with men to do that.
And then, before we go to break, do you feel like then we're losing ground in some ways? The culture is making it even more likely you're going to arrest a bunch of people every time you have an ad. Is it more likely now than it was 10 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. The number one recruiting tool for traffickers is Facebook and other social media sites. The advent of peer-to-peer communications and encrypted communications, anonymizing apps and websites just make it that much harder for law enforcement to do their job, and makes it easier and easier for traffickers to find victims.
Fascinating and a bit concerning. All right, we're going to take a break, and I want to come back. We're going to talk about big tech and the role big tech plays in this. What responsibility does big tech have? What could we do to regulate that better along these lines? So we'll take a break. Be back right after this.